June 6, 1944. 0:16 in the morning. A Horsa glider slams into French soil at over 60 miles an hour, with no engine, no warning, and no mercy for the men inside it. Two pilots are thrown clean through the shattered nose of the aircraft. A young lieutenant named Den Brotheridge is already sprinting across a canal bridge with a grenade in his fist, screaming orders into the dark. Seconds later, a German rifle round tears through his throat. He falls on the very bridge he has just captured, becoming the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on the longest day in modern history. The grenade explodes. The bunker beside it goes silent. And in less than 10 minutes, 181 men change the outcome of World War II before a single American boot has even touched the sand at Omaha Beach. This is not the invasion you were taught in school. This is the 6 minutes. Nobody talks about the 6 minutes that made everything else possible. And it starts with a police officer from Oxford, who was never supposed to be a soldier at all. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historic turning points, and moments that changed the course of the war. His name was John Howard. Before the war, he walked a beat in Oxford, England, writing citations and breaking up pub fights, an ordinary man with an ordinary job in an ordinary town. Nobody who watched him check shop-front locks on a rainy English night could have guessed that in less than a decade, he would be personally responsible for deciding whether Nazi Germany could reinforce the beaches of Normandy in time to throw the entire Allied invasion back into the sea. By the time this story ends, you will understand why military historians consider what happened at two small bridges outside a town called Bénouville to be the single most important 6 minutes of June 6, 1944. 6 minutes that determined whether D-Day succeeded or collapsed into the worst military catastrophe in Allied history. To understand why an unglamorous police officer and 180 men in 3 flimsy plywood gliders held the fate of the entire invasion in their hands. You have to understand what Nazi Germany was planning to do the moment those beaches were hit. By the spring of 1944, German High Command knew an Allied invasion of France was coming. They didn't know exactly where or when, but they knew the geography, they knew the tides, and they had spent years building the Atlantic Wall to make sure that wherever the Allies landed, it would cost them everything. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man tasked with defending the French coast, had studied the mechanics of amphibious invasion obsessively, and he had reached one brutally simple conclusion. The first 24 hours would decide the entire war. Not the first week, not the first month, the first day. If German armor could reach the beaches while Allied soldiers were still soaked, disorganized, and pinned against the surf with nowhere to retreat, the invasion could be crushed before it ever got started. Rommel called it the longest day, and he meant to make sure it belonged to Germany. His plan depended on speed. Panzer divisions, the same armored killers that had rolled through Poland, France, and half of Russia, were stationed within striking distance of the coast, ready to slam into any beachhead within hours of the first landing craft touching sand. And there was only one route those tanks could take to reach the eastern flank of the invasion zone near the city of Caen. That route ran directly across 2 small crossings over the Orne River and the Orne Canal just outside the sleepy market town of Bénouville. No detour, no alternative road. If German tanks wanted to reach the beaches in time to stop the invasion cold, they had to cross those 2 bridges. Full stop. The Germans knew this. They had wired both bridges with demolition charges ready to blow them the instant a threat appeared. Because even if the bridges themselves were lost, at least the crossing point would be denied to the Allies too. It was airtight. It was logical. It assumed the threat, whenever it came, would arrive from the direction of the sea, hours after the first waves hit the beach, giving German engineers and infantry plenty of warning to prepare. Nobody in the German High Command imagined the attack could come from directly above them, in absolute silence, hours before the invasion had technically even begun. This is where an ordinary Oxford policeman becomes the most dangerous man in Normandy. John Howard had spent 18 months preparing a single unit of British soldiers D Company of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry for a mission that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. He drilled them relentlessly. He was not a natural soldier, not a career officer bred for command, but he was fiercely methodical, and he built a training regime so intense that his men later said they could navigate that landing zone blindfolded. What Howard was preparing his men for sounded to almost everyone who heard it completely insane. The plan was this: 6 massive plywood gliders, each one packed with roughly 30 fully equipped soldiers, would be towed across the English Channel in total darkness by heavy bombers. At 11,000 feet over enemy territory, the tow ropes would be released. From that moment forward, there would be no engines, no power, and no second chances. The pilots would have to glide silently through pitch-black skies and land these enormous unpowered aircraft in narrow fields beside a heavily defended bridge, close enough that Howard's men could sprint the distance and take the position before German sentries had time to react. The tolerance for error was measured in seconds and meters. Land too far away and the element of surprise evaporates. The alarm goes up, and the demolition charges detonate before a single British boot reaches the structure. Land too close, and the glider crashes directly into the canal or into the German defenses themselves, killing everyone aboard before the mission even begins. Military planners who reviewed the concept called it reckless. Landing a heavy unpowered glider within 50 meters of an enemy-held target in the dark, with zero margin for pilot error, was considered by many senior officers to border on suicidal. Horsa gliders were not precision aircraft. They were slow-heavy, difficult to control, and utterly unforgiving of miscalculation. A single misjudged approach vector, a gust of wind, a tree line calculated a few feet wrong, and the entire operation would end not in victory, but in a smoking wreck in a French field, with no bridge captured, and no element of surprise remaining for the paratroopers who would need those crossings held. Some officers argued for a conventional parachute assault instead, spreading the risk across a wider area. Howard and his glider pilots disagreed. A parachute drop would scatter men across the countryside in the dark, costing precious minutes they didn't have. The bridges needed to be taken whole fast, and by surprise or not at all. It had to be gliders. It had to be now. And it had to work on the very first attempt because there would be no second try. The man responsible for making that impossible landing a reality was Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, the pilot of the lead glider. Walwork had trained on a scale model of the target, built from aerial reconnaissance photographs, memorizing the height of every tree, the angle of every hedgerow, the exact silhouette of the bridge against the horizon, until he claimed he could draw the entire landing zone from memory in complete darkness. For months, Howard's men rehearsed the assault over and over, timing their sprint from the gliders to the bridge down to the second, because everyone involved understood a brutal mathematical truth. If German sentries had even 2 minutes of warning, the charges would blow, the bridges would fall into the canal, and the entire eastern flank of the Allied invasion would be exposed to a panzer counterattack with nothing standing in its way. Then came the night nobody who lived through it would ever forget. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, the tow ropes released over the coast of France, and 6 gliders began their silent, powerless descent toward 2 bridges that Nazi Germany had spent months preparing to defend and destroy. Inside the lead aircraft, Walwork fought the controls in total darkness, judging his approach purely from memory and instinct, aiming for a strip of ground barely large enough to contain the crash landing he knew was coming. At 3 minutes past midnight, the glider slammed into the earth with such violence that both pilots were hurled through the shattered cockpit nose. Walwork was knocked unconscious instantly, his body broken, unaware whether the impossible landing had actually succeeded. Major Howard, thrown forward inside the fuselage, came to and found himself alive, upright, and staring through the wreckage at the unmistakable silhouette of the canal bridge, illuminated faintly by starlight. The wingtip of his glider had come to rest just 47 meters from the structure. 47 meters. After 18 months of training, after every calculation, every rehearsal, every argument about whether this was even possible, Wallwork had landed a fully loaded assault glider close enough to a defended target at midnight in total darkness that Howard's men could reach it, running before the German garrison even understood what was happening. On the German side, the sentries guarding that bridge that night were not elite frontline troops. They were a patchwork garrison, some regular infantry, some conscripted soldiers with limited loyalty and even less alertness. A corporal manning the western post heard the impact and had no idea what it meant. He later described it as a rushing sound, followed by an impact that shook the ground beneath his feet, something he had never heard before because nobody had ever heard a combat glider crash land before. He hesitated, unsure whether to sound the alarm or wait for more information. That hesitation cost Germany the war's most decisive bridgehead. While the German corporal stood frozen with confusion, Howard's men were already out of the wreckage and running. Lieutenant Den Brutheridge led the charge straight across the canal bridge at a dead sprint, throwing a grenade into a concrete bunker before a German round caught him in the neck. He became the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day, but his charge had already broken the defense. The demolition wires meant to blow the bridge into the canal were found intact but never triggered. The German soldier responsible for detonating them had fled without firing a shot. The second bridge, a few hundred meters away, fell almost as easily, its garrison overwhelmed in moments. One fleeing sentry, later found hiding in a ditch, having abandoned his post without even attempting to sound a general alarm. By 5 minutes past midnight, less than 10 full minutes after the first glider had crashed into that field, both bridges belonged to 181 British soldiers, armed with rifles, light machine guns, and a handful of unreliable anti-tank weapons. The entire German plan to rush armor toward the eastern beaches of Normandy had just been quietly, invisibly, and catastrophically dismantled, and almost nobody in the German chain of command yet had any idea it had happened. What came next was hours of desperate German counterattacks, confused radio reports, officers driving straight into ambushes, and an armored division sitting paralyzed for lack of clear orders. While Howard's exhausted, outnumbered company held the line against everything the Germans could throw at them, refusing to give up the crossing that an entire panzer division needed in order to reach the invasion beaches at all. But that fight, the fight to hold what they had just taken, the fight against tanks, artillery, and a growing German realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong on their eastern flank, that is a story bigger than these first 10 minutes. Because holding a bridge for a few hours against a disorganized response is one thing. Holding it against the full weight of a panzer division, determined to punch through at any cost, is something else entirely. And as dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, that is exactly the storm bearing down on 181 exhausted men who had already given everything they had just to get there. In Part 2, you'll see what happened when German armor finally got its orders, when half-tracks and tanks came rolling down that narrow road toward the bridge, and when a corporal who had never fired his anti-tank weapon in combat found himself with one shot to stop them cold. The headlights came around the bend at 4 in the morning, and for a moment, nobody on either side of the canal bridge said a word. A column of German trucks was rolling down the road from Bénouville, engines rattling in the dark headlights cutting through the mist, like the enemy had no idea what was waiting for them. And they didn't. This was a company from the 736th Infantry Regiment sent to retake a crossing their commanders assumed was still lightly held, if it was held by anyone at all. They had no idea that 181 British soldiers had spent the last 4 hours digging into every ditch, hedge, and doorway on both banks of that canal. They had no idea the bridge that was supposed to be theirs by dawn had already changed hands completely, silently, and permanently. The lead truck came around the final bend with its headlights blazing, and it drove directly into a wall of concentrated British fire. The column stopped dead. Soldiers spilled out of the trucks and tried to push forward across open ground, and they were cut down before they covered 20 meters. They regrouped. They tried again from a different angle. They were thrown back again. This was not going to be a quiet morning for anyone. By the time the sky started to lighten over Normandy, a second wave arrived, And this one was worse. Half-tracks. An armored car. Maybe a light tank. Nobody on the British side could tell for certain in the gray pre-dawn light. And it didn't matter, because armor meant one thing. If that vehicle got across the bridge, or even close enough to bring its main gun to bear on Howard's dug-in positions, the entire fight was over. 181 men with rifles and light machine guns do not survive a sustained armored assault. Everyone on that bridge understood the math. And the only thing standing between D Company and a very short, very bloody defeat was a single man in a ditch beside the road, holding a weapon he had trained with, but never once fired at a living target. His name was Corporal Bill Gray, and the weapon in his hands was a PIATA British anti-tank launcher that was by every honest account temperamental, inaccurate, and prone to catastrophic failure at exactly the wrong moment. It had a punishing recoil. It required the operator to load a heavy, spring-loaded bomb by hand, kneel or lie exposed while aiming, and hold his position under direct fire long enough to guarantee a hit, because a miss meant the enemy vehicle kept coming, and there would be no time to reload. Gray had trained on this weapon for months. He had never used it in actual combat. And now, in the gray half-light of the most important morning of the war, it was down to him. He waited. That is the part that should stop you cold. He did not panic. He did not fire early out of fear. He let the armored vehicle close the distance, watching it grow larger through his sights, knowing that every second of delay was a second closer to a miss becoming impossible, and a hit becoming certain, and also a second closer to that vehicle's gun swinging toward his own position. He fired once. The vehicle took the hit directly and began to burn. The German infantry following behind it, suddenly stripped of their armored support, broke and scattered. The second German counterattack of the morning had just collapsed in the space of a single trigger pull from a man who had never done this before in his life. A German battalion commander filed a report on the fighting at Bénouville that morning, and if you want to understand exactly how thoroughly the German counterattack had failed, you don't need casualty numbers. You need his own words. He described the position as held by a force of unknown size, with apparent anti-tank capability, and stated flatly that his infantry could not advance without armor support, and that the bridges could not be retaken by the forces available to him. Read that again. The bridges the German army needed in order to send tanks toward the beaches were being held by British infantry, who were preventing German tanks from reaching them at all. The entire eastern flank of the Normandy invasion had folded into a closed loop, and the Germans were trapped inside their own strategy. But here is where the story gets almost impossible to believe, because the failure at the bridge was only the smallest visible fracture in a German command structure that was falling apart everywhere at once. And understanding just how badly it was falling apart is the only way to understand why 181 men were able to hold that position for 10 straight hours against an army that on paper could have erased them in 20 minutes. Start with the man who was supposed to be commanding the response. General Friedrich Dahlmann, in charge of the German 7th Army. The force directly responsible for defending this entire stretch of coastline was not at his headquarters when the invasion began. He was in the city of Rennes, participating in a war game exercise, a training simulation of an Allied invasion that was in a detail almost too cruel to be true, modeling a scenario disturbingly close to the real one, currently unfolding without him. His staff scrambled to reach him. Precious hours evaporated while the man responsible for organizing the German response to the actual invasion was 2 hours away, pretending to fight a fictional one. Then there was Rommel himself, the field marshal who had spent months warning that the first 24 hours would decide everything. The man who had personally argued for positioning panzer divisions close enough to the coast to strike immediately was not in France at all. He had left the day before, convinced by weather reports predicting rough seas that an Allied landing was not imminent, and he had traveled home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The single officer most responsible for preparing Germany's defense against exactly this scenario was not there to command it when it actually happened. And then there was the armor itself. Because even with Dahlmann absent and Rommel absent, there was still a panzer division stationed close enough to potentially reach Bénouville and smash through the exhausted defenders holding those bridges. The 21st Panzer Division, under General Edgar Feuchtinger, sat within striking distance of Caen. And it did not move. Not because it couldn't, because it wasn't allowed to. This is the detail that should genuinely make you angry on Germany's behalf if you were a German officer standing in that command post on the morning of June 6th. Adolf Hitler had personally insisted that his panzer reserves could not be committed to battle without his direct authorization. Not the authorization of the field commander standing on the ground, watching an invasion unfold in real time. Hitler's authorization, specifically, from Germany, where he was, according to multiple accounts, asleep, and where his staff were reportedly too intimidated to wake him with news of an Allied invasion that some of them still weren't entirely certain was the real one, and not a diversion. So while Bill Gray was lying in a ditch waiting for an armored vehicle to get close enough to hit with a weapon that could easily have jammed and gotten him killed. Instead, an entire panzer division sat idle less than a day's fight away, waiting for a signature that would not come until the late morning hours after the invasion had already begun in earnest along every beach in Normandy. When authorization finally did arrive, Feuchtinger pushed his column north toward the coast, toward the very bridges his forces desperately needed to cross. And that is when the second half of the trap sprang shut. Because waiting directly in his path, dropping out of the afternoon sky in an even larger wave than the gliders that had taken the bridges at midnight, was the second half of the 6th Airborne Division paratroopers and gliders descending by the thousands directly across the German line of advance. Feuchtinger watched it happen from his own command post and reported with something close to disbelief in his own words that at approximately 5 in the afternoon, his forces observed what appeared to be an entire airborne division landing directly in their path, and that forward movement had become impossible. He was not exaggerating for effect. He was watching British paratroopers land exactly where British planners had calculated they needed to land in order to seal the one gap in the German defense that Feuchtinger's tanks might have used to reach the beaches after all. Every piece of this operation, the midnight glider assault on the bridges, the additional airborne landings hours later, had been designed as a single interlocking mechanism. Take the bridges, hold the bridges, block the only alternate route. And it had worked so completely that a Panzer Division commander was staring out at the battlefield, describing his own advance as literally impossible. Back at the bridge itself, none of this context was available to the exhausted men still holding their positions along both banks of the canal and the river. All they knew was that the attacks kept coming in smaller and smaller waves, less and less coordinated each time, and that somehow, hour after hour, they were still holding. Morning became midday. The German pressure, which should have mounted into a final overwhelming assault by now, instead seemed to be losing coherence, fragmenting into isolated probing attacks that Howard's men picked apart one at a time. Nobody holding that position understood yet that they weren't just surviving a disorganized enemy. They were the reason the enemy was disorganized. Their bridge, their fight, their 10 hours of refusing to give an inch had become the single obstacle preventing an entire German armored counteroffensive from ever forming up in the first place. Then, a little after noon, they heard something almost nobody expected to hear on a battlefield in Normandy. Bagpipes. Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade had come ashore at Sword Beach that morning and fought their way inland through 6 miles of coastal defenses, hedgerows, and scattered German resistance, moving toward the one objective that mattered more than any other on the eastern flank. The bridges at Bénouville, where they knew, or at least hoped, that airborne forces had secured a crossing point hours earlier. Lovett had made Howard a promise back during the planning of the operation. His commandos would reach the bridge by exactly midday. And as his column came marching over the canal bridge that Howard's men had bled to hold since 5 minutes past midnight with his personal piper, a young man named Bill Millen playing at the head of the column while German mortar fire fell intermittently around them, Lovett's watch put his arrival at 2 minutes and 30 seconds past noon. 2 minutes and 30 seconds late, after crossing an entire invasion beach and 6 miles of enemy territory to get there. Howard exhausted his uniform still soaked from the glider landing 12 hours earlier, shook his hand on the bridge, his company had refused to surrender through an entire night and morning of German counterattacks. The bridgehead was real. The link-up was complete. The eastern flank of the largest amphibious invasion in human history had held. Somewhere outside the British perimeter, a German intelligence officer from the 751st Regiment was watching the scene through field glasses, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. And he filed a report estimating the size of the force that had held those bridges against everything Germany had thrown at it that morning. His estimate was between 800 and 1,000 men backed by armored support. Major John Howard had exactly 181 men. No armor. 6 anti-tank weapons, most of which had never fired a shot in anger before that morning. That German officer was not a fool, and he was not exaggerating out of embarrassment. He was looking at the outcome of 10 hours of sustained combat against a position that by every rational military calculation should have fallen in the first hour, and he simply could not conceive of a force that small holding out that long. His mistake was, in its own strange way, the highest compliment the German army ever paid to D Company Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire light infantry. The cost of those 10 hours was real, and it deserves to be said plainly, rather than buried under the scale of the victory. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, who had led the very first charge across the canal bridge before the Germans had even fully processed what was happening, did not live to see the link-up with Lovett's commandos. He died on the bridge itself within the first minutes of the assault, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on the longest day of the war. Others fell during the counterattacks that followed through the night and morning. Major Howard himself would survive the day, only to be badly injured later in the campaign in a vehicle accident during the breakout fighting that followed the beachhead's consolidation. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, who had piloted that first glider to a landing so precise it still gets studied by military planners today, flew that entire mission with what turned out to be 2 broken bones sustained in the crash, and recovered from his injuries after the war. Corporal Bill Gray, the man who had never fired a PIAT at a real target before that morning, and ended a German armored assault with a single shot, survived the war entirely. In the days and weeks that followed, as German officers began compiling after-action reports, trying to understand exactly how their defensive strategy for Normandy had unraveled so completely and so quickly, one report written by a staff officer of the 7th Army stated the conclusion in terms that leave very little room for ambiguity. He wrote that the loss of the bridges at Bénouville, before the invasion's official start, had removed every possibility of an early armored counterattack against the eastern beach sector, that German forces could not cross, could not seal the perimeter, and that everything that followed in the campaign was, in his own words, the direct consequence. Everything that followed. Think about what that sentence actually contains. It means the entire subsequent battle for Normandy, the brutal weeks of fighting through the hedgerows, the eventual breakout that shattered the German position in France. All of it traces back through an unbroken chain of cause and effect to 2 small crossings over a canal and a river that most people who study World War II have still never heard of. Not Omaha. Not the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. A bridge outside a market town taken in less than 10 minutes by men who trained for 18 months to do exactly one job perfectly in the dark on the first and only attempt they would ever get. General Hans Speidel, who served as Rommel's own chief of staff, wrote after the war with the clear-eyed precision of a man who had spent years dissecting exactly where everything had gone wrong, and he identified the loss of those crossings as the tactical defeat from which every subsequent operational failure of the Normandy campaign directly derived. He put it this way: the eastern flank was open to German forces until the moment it wasn't, and by the time it was closed, it had already been closed before the German command even understood it needed defending, before they knew it needed to be defended. Sit with that for a second, because it is the single most damning sentence any German officer wrote about the entire Normandy campaign. It means the war for the eastern flank of D-Day was already lost, while most of the German army guarding that sector was still asleep, still unaware, still operating under the assumption that whatever was happening out there in the dark could wait until morning to be dealt with properly. It could not wait. It had already been decided in the first 10 minutes after midnight by a police officer from Oxford, a glider pilot who landed with 2 broken bones and kept fighting anyway, and a corporal who fired an unreliable weapon he had never used in combat and did not miss. By the time John Howard finally handed over his exhausted, battered company's positions to fresh commando reinforcements. Later that first day, the fight for the bridges was over. But the fight for Normandy, the fight to actually break out of that narrow strip of French coastline and push the German army back across an entire continent, that fight was just beginning. And the bocage country waiting inland, the dense hedgerow terrain that would swallow tanks and turn every field into its own private battlefield for weeks to come, was about to prove that holding a bridgehead and breaking out of one were 2 entirely different kinds of impossible. That is where the story goes next. Because the bridge was won, the eastern flank held. But an entire German army was still out there, reorganizing, regrouping, and looking for the next opportunity to throw everything it had left at the men who had just handed it its first and most consequential defeat of the invasion. The bridge had held. But less than 48 hours later, John Howard's exhausted survivors would watch an entirely new nightmare roll toward them out of the hedgerows, and this time, it would not be a confused garrison of conscripts stumbling into an ambush in the dark. This time, it would be the SS. By June 8th, German intelligence had finally pieced together what had actually happened at Bénouville on the night of the invasion, and the realization landed like a physical blow. This was not a lucky airborne scattering that happened to drift near a bridge. This was a deliberate, rehearsed surgical strike, planned for months, executed with a precision German commanders had genuinely never encountered before. Reconnaissance officers who walked the site afterward reported glider wreckage clustered so tightly around the bridge approaches that the landing pattern looked less like an accident of war and more like a diagram. German commanders now understood they were facing an enemy that had trained an entire company to do one specific, narrow, impossible thing, and had pulled it off in a single attempt with no rehearsal on the actual ground. That realization terrified them because it meant the eastern flank of Normandy was not a fluke. It was a preview. And now, this was not a defensive experiment anymore. This was not a single night of confusion and improvised counterattacks by second-rate garrison troops who broke and ran at the first sign of resistance. Now the German High Command was sending in the forces built specifically to punch through exactly this kind of lightly armed airborne perimeter, and the casualty numbers coming out of the eastern flank in the days immediately after D-Day tell you everything about how seriously Germany was now taking the threat. Within the first week alone, the 6th Airborne Division holding the ground east of the Orne would suffer over 1,000 casualties, nearly a quarter of its total strength, in a running battle that never really stopped day or night for the better part of 10 days. The unit sent to break that perimeter was the 346th Infantry Division, reinforced within days by elements of the 21st Panzer Division, and more dangerously elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitlerjugend, one of the most fanatically committed formations in the entire German army, filled with young soldiers indoctrinated since childhood, and led by officers who had proven at other points in the Normandy campaign that they would take casualties other commanders considered unacceptable in order to achieve an objective. These were not the confused, half-hearted attackers who had driven trucks with their headlights on into Howard's guns on the night of the invasion. These were soldiers who understood exactly what was at stake, and they came at the eastern flank of the bridgehead with mortars, artillery, and armor, probing every single day for a weak point in the thin green line of British paratroopers and glider infantry holding a perimeter that had never been designed to survive sustained conventional assault. But the German response was not only about brute force, it was also about intelligence and denial. German engineers and commanders, having lost the 2 bridges that controlled the entire eastern approach to Caen, now understood that holding the surrounding high ground was the only way to contain the damage, to prevent the bridgehead from expanding into a launching point for a full-scale breakout. And so began 10 days of some of the most brutal close-quarters attritional fighting of the entire Normandy campaign. Fighting that rarely makes it into the popular history of D-Day because it happened in small villages and orchards that had no glamorous name attached to them, fought by men who had already given everything just to take the bridges in the first place and now had to hold that ground against an enemy that was day by day growing angrier and more determined. But the danger to the bridgehead was not only coming from outside the perimeter, it was also coming from within it. By the second week of June, the strain on the 6th Airborne Division was becoming impossible to ignore. This was a lightly armed force designed by its very nature to strike fast and hold briefly until relieved by heavier units. And instead it had been holding an exposed defensive line for over a week. Against a steadily reinforcing enemy absorbing casualties it had never been equipped to sustain over that length of time. Ammunition for the PIATs, already unreliable and in short supply on the first night, was running dangerously low. Radios were failing. Men who had jumped or glided into Normandy expecting a mission measured in hours were now fighting a static defensive battle measured in days, sleeping in slit trenches under intermittent artillery fire, watching friends they had trained alongside for 18 months get carried past them on stretchers. Major General Richard Gale, commanding the 6th Airborne, faced mounting pressure from his own exhausted brigade commanders, who understood better than anyone how thin the line had become. And there were real documented conversations at division level about whether the eastern perimeter, magnificent as its initial achievement had been, could actually be held against a determined SS Panzer assault without reinforcement that simply was not available yet. There was a specific moment where the entire operation nearly unraveled, and it centered on a small village called Bénouville, sitting on high ground at the northeastern edge of the bridgehead, a position so tactically important that whichever side controlled it effectively controlled whether the entire eastern flank could hold or would eventually be forced to collapse inward. German forces held Bénouville, and from it their artillery observers could see almost the entire British position below them directing fire onto Howard's men at the bridge, onto the paratroop battalions, holding the perimeter, onto every position that mattered. An earlier attempt to clear the village had failed, and failed badly, with a British battalion taking devastating casualties in an assault that some senior officers privately considered close to a disaster. Confidence within the division was shaken. There were officers on the ground exhausted watching casualty lists grow daily, who genuinely questioned whether the eastern bridgehead, the very thing that had made the entire D-Day plan work, could survive another week of this kind of pressure. It is worth being honest about that moment, because the story of Pegasus Bridge is too often told as an unbroken triumph, when the truth is that for about 72 hours in the middle of June 1944, the outcome of holding that ground was genuinely seriously in doubt. Then came June 12th, and the decision that broke the crisis wide open. Major General Gale ordered a second assault on Bénouville this time, concentrating every available resource the division could scrape together, including reserves that had originally been held back for other purposes, because everyone involved now understood there would be no third attempt. If this attack failed, the eastern perimeter would very likely have to contract, potentially exposing the bridges themselves to renewed German pressure from higher ground. The enemy would then control unopposed. The attack went in on the evening of June 12th under heavy preparatory artillery fire, coordinated with everything the division's remaining armor and infantry could throw into a single concentrated push against a village German forces had spent days fortifying and reinforcing with exactly the kind of panzer support that had made the position so dangerous in the first place. The fighting for Bénouville that night was as vicious as anything in the entire Normandy campaign. British paratroopers advanced across open fire-swept ground into a village defended by SS Panzer Grenadiers and supported by tanks dug into hull-down firing positions among the buildings. Artillery from both sides pounded the same few hundred meters of French farmland simultaneously, meaning British soldiers were being hit, not only by German fire, but in the chaos and confusion of a night assault, occasionally by shells from their own supporting batteries as well. A horror of close-quarters warfare that survivors described in unflinching terms decades later. Lord Lovat, whose commandos had marched over Pegasus Bridge to the sound of bagpipes on D-Day itself, was severely wounded in the fighting for the surrounding positions, hit by shell fragments that very nearly killed him, and ended his active combat service for the remainder of the war. The casualty rate among the assaulting battalions that night was catastrophic by any measure. Entire companies reduced to a fraction of their starting strength in a matter of hours. and by dawn on June 13th, the village was in British hands. It had cost more than any single engagement since the bridges themselves had been taken a week earlier, but it broke the German ability to observe and direct fire onto the eastern bridgehead from commanding high ground, and it broke something in the German offensive tempo as well. The attacks that had come daily, sometimes multiple times a day, for the better part of 10 straight days, began to slacken. German formations that had been probing for a weak point in the perimeter instead began shifting, posture, digging in defensively, rather than continuing to press an assault that had already cost them heavily and produced no breakthrough. The eastern flank, which had been held open only by the thinnest possible margin since the very first minutes after midnight on June 6th, was now finally genuinely secure. The strategic consequences of that single week of fighting, from the moment Howard's gliders hit the ground to the moment Bénouville fell, reached far beyond the immediate ground that changed hands. The entire German operational picture for the Normandy campaign had been built around the assumption that armor concentrated near Caen could eventually punch east and roll up the Allied beachhead from its most vulnerable flank. Every day that flank held every division German commanders were forced to commit to trying and failing to break it was a division that could not be used to reinforce the desperate defense of Caen itself, could not be redeployed to threaten the American sector to the west, could not be held in reserve for the counterattack German doctrine had always assumed would eventually come. Historians studying German troop movements in the weeks after D-Day have noted that a disproportionate share of German armored and infantry reinforcement, units that were desperately needed elsewhere, along an increasingly overstretched front, were instead tied down, attempting to dislodge a bridgehead that by any reasonable pre-war calculation, a lightly armed airborne division should never have been able to hold for this long against sustained panzer support. News of what had happened at the bridges and in the fighting around Bénouville spread through the Allied chain of command within days, and its effect on morale was immediate and measurable. Soldiers preparing to push inland from the beaches, fighting through the brutal claustrophobic hedgerow country that would come to define the summer of 1944 in Normandy, now had a concrete example discussed in briefings and passed soldier to soldier of an objective that had seemed genuinely impossible on paper being achieved by a force a fraction of the size anyone would have expected to need for the job. War correspondents picked up the story within the first week, and while wartime censorship limited exactly how much detail could be published immediately, the broad shape of what had happened, a tiny force landing by glider in total darkness and holding a vital bridge against everything the German army could throw at it, became one of the earliest and most repeated legends to come out of the Normandy campaign, told and retold in Allied press coverage throughout that summer, as proof that the invasion's opening moves had gone far better than German propaganda was willing to admit. On the German side, the effect was the opposite and just as measurable. Officers who had spent the war up to this point confident in the predictability of Allied tactics now had to reckon with an enemy capable of achieving total tactical surprise through methods nobody in the German high command had adequately prepared for. Reports filed in the weeks after the battle show a marked shift in German assessments of Allied airborne capability, treating glider assault as a credible and dangerous tool rather than the experimental novelty it had largely been considered before June 6th. That shift in perception had consequences that rippled outward for the rest of the war, shaping how German commanders positioned reserves and planned defenses against future Allied operations, always now with one eye toward the possibility that critical infrastructure might be seized whole silently before a single defending soldier understood what was happening. The men who had made all of this possible were by mid-June a shadow of the company that had crash-landed in the dark 10 days earlier. Of the 181 men who had flown in on those 6 gliders, a significant number were dead wounded or so exhausted by 10 straight days of continuous combat that they had to be rotated out of the line entirely once relief finally became available. Major Howard himself, who had led the initial assault with such precision and held the position with such stubborn determination through that first brutal night, remained in command through the following days of the eastern bridgehead's defense before eventually being pulled back with the survivors of his company. What had begun as a mission measured in minutes take the bridge's hold until relief had turned into one of the longest continuous small unit engagements of the entire Normandy campaign. And the men who lived through all of it emerged from those 10 days changed in ways that decades of later interviews and memoirs would spend a lifetime trying to fully articulate. By the time the wider Normandy campaign finally broke open in August, with Allied armor pouring through the collapsing German lines around the Falaise pocket and the German position in France disintegrating in a matter of weeks. After 2 months of brutal attritional fighting, the eastern flank secured by Pegasus Bridge had become such a permanent, unshakable feature of the Allied position that it was easy to forget just how close the entire eastern half of the invasion had come to falling apart in its very first hours, and again, almost as dangerously in the fighting around Bénouville a week later. Military historians studying the campaign afterward would return again and again to the same conclusion. Every subsequent Allied success east of Caen, every mile of ground gained in the brutal summer fighting that followed, rested on a foundation laid in the first 10 minutes after midnight on June 6th and defended at enormous cost over the 10 days that followed by men who had never expected to still be fighting for that same patch of French ground a full week and a half after their mission was supposed to have ended. What happened to those men after the war? How the story of Pegasus Bridge was remembered, forgotten, and eventually rediscovered. And what became of the bridge itself in the decades that followed? That is a story that reveals something remarkable about how history chooses to remember its turning points. And it is not the story most people expect. The bridge held. The bagpipes came. The German counterattack broke against a company that should have been overrun in the first 20 minutes, and instead lasted through 10 days of the fiercest close-quarters fighting in the entire Normandy campaign. That is where we left off, with an eastern flank finally secure, and a German army forced for the rest of the summer to fight this war without the one road it needed most. But there is a question that documentaries about D-Day almost never answer, and it is the question that actually matters most once the guns fall silent. What happened to the man who made it possible? What happened to John Howard, the Oxford policeman who led 181 men into the dark and came out the other side having changed the outcome of the war before breakfast, because the ending of this story is not what you would expect, and there is a twist buried in it that almost nobody outside of Normandy has ever heard. John Howard survived June the 6th. He survived the 10 brutal days of fighting that followed at Bénouville and along the eastern perimeter. He survived, in fact, all the way through the summer of 1944. Commanding his company through the grinding, exhausting campaign that followed the initial landings. The kind of campaign that never gets its own movie because it consists mostly of mud hedgerows and attrition rather than a single dramatic night. And then in August of that same year, with the Normandy campaign already breaking open and Allied forces beginning the push that would eventually liberate Paris. Howard was badly injured, not by enemy fire, but in a vehicle accident during the confused, fast-moving fighting of the breakout. He broke his leg severely enough that his war in any active combat sense was effectively over. The man who had piloted the single most precise and consequential night assault of the entire invasion did not go out in a blaze of glory on some later battlefield. He went out sitting in a hospital bed out of the fight, while the war he had helped make possible rolled onward without him for another 8 months. He came home to England still recovering, and what happened next is the part of this story that deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because it tells you something true and slightly uncomfortable about how history actually treats its heroes. John Howard did not become a celebrity. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his actions at the bridges, a serious and well-earned military honor, and for a period after the war, he remained in the army. But the wider public recognition, the kind of fame that turns a name into a household word, simply did not come, not in any immediate sense. He eventually left military service, and in a detail that has a certain quiet symmetry to it, went back to something close to where he had started before the war. He worked as a civil servant. He held an ordinary administrative post. The man who had commanded the operation that historians would later describe as the tactical hinge of the entire Normandy invasion, spent years afterward doing paperwork in an office largely unrecognized by the general public, walking past him on the street. It would be easy to tell this part of the story as a tragedy, the forgotten hero shuffled into obscurity while lesser men got the parades. But that is not quite what happened either, and this is where the story becomes something richer than a simple tale of neglect. Because within the tight, specific world of the men who had actually been there on both sides of the fight, John Howard was never forgotten for a single year. Every June for decades, veterans of the operation returned to Bénouville, to the bridge itself, to walk the same ground where they had crash-landed as young men, and to remember the friends who never got the chance to grow old alongside them. Den Brotheridge, the lieutenant who died charging across that bridge in the first minutes of the assault, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on the longest day of the war, was buried nearby in the Ranville War Cemetery, close enough to the bridge he captured that his grave remains to this day, part of the pilgrimage veterans and their families make every anniversary. And here is a detail that should stop you cold if you have not heard it before. Brotheridge's wife was pregnant when he died. He never met his daughter. She was born months after her father fell on that bridge, and she grew up carrying a name connected forever to the single most decisive night of the entire war. A father she knew only through photographs, medals, and the stories other men told about the 6 seconds it took him to cross that bridge and change history. That is the human cost sitting underneath every triumphant statistic in this story, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than rushed past on the way to the legacy and the lessons. Victory at Pegasus Bridge was real. It was decisive. It was, by any honest historical measure, one of the most important tactical achievements of the entire war. And it was also purchased with the kind of loss that does not show up cleanly in strategic assessments, the kind that follows families for the rest of their lives. But here is the mini-hook buried inside Howard's own post-war story. The thing that turns his quiet, unglamorous return to civilian life into something genuinely moving rather than simply sad. Because John Howard's real legacy was never going to be found in medals or job titles. It was found in what he chose to do with the rest of his life once the war was finally completely behind him. Howard became, for the remaining decades of his life, the unofficial custodian of the memory of what his company had done. He returned to Normandy again and again, not as a celebrity seeking recognition, but as a man determined to make sure the story was told accurately, that the names of the men who died were not allowed to fade into a footnote beneath the larger, more famous drama of the beaches. He worked with historians, gave interviews, walked journalists and documentary crews across the exact ground his glider had landed on, pointing out the 47-meter distance to the bridge that had made the entire operation possible, a distance he could apparently still measure by eye decades later without hesitation. When Pegasus Bridge finally received the recognition it deserved in popular history, largely through Stephen Ambrose's research and the resulting book and film that carried the operation story to a global audience decades after the war, it was substantially because John Howard had spent 30 years making sure the story was still there to be told. Still accurate, still anchored to the real men and the real cost, rather than dissolving into legend. He died in 1999, having lived to see his company's achievement finally take its proper place in the wider public understanding of D-Day, having lived to see the bridge itself renamed Pegasus Bridge, in honor of the winged horse emblem of the 6th Airborne Division, having lived to attend reunion after reunion at the very café beside the bridge, where French civilians had celebrated the first liberation of France within hours of the landing. That café still stands today, still run by the same family. And it carries its own small secret, that most visitors never learn a detail that connects directly back to the very planning of the operation itself. And we will return to it in a moment, because it is one of the most quietly astonishing footnotes in this entire story. First, though, the legacy that actually matters at the level of military history. The reason this operation is still taught in officer training academies around the world, more than 80 years later. What Howard and his glider pilots pioneered on the night of June 6, 1944, was not simply a daring one-off stunt. It was the first large-scale, fully successful demonstration of what military planners now call a coup de main operation, a precise small unit strike designed to seize a critical objective through total surprise before the enemy has any chance to react, rather than through overwhelming force applied over time. Before Pegasus Bridge, the concept existed in theory. After Pegasus Bridge, it existed as proven doctrine backed by a real-world case study so complete and so successful that military academies from Sandhurst to West Point have used it as a teaching model for generations of officers ever since. The specific combination of elements that made it work: silent glider infiltration, obsessive rehearsal on scale models built from aerial photography, an assault timed and executed with second-by-second precision, became a template that shaped airborne and special operations doctrine for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. You can trace a direct conceptual line from what happened at Bénouville to later operations built on the same core principle, striking a critical narrow objective with a small, superbly trained force before the enemy even understands an attack is underway. The broader logic of precision infrastructure seizure, holding a single decisive point rather than attempting to control an entire battlefield, became a foundational concept in special operations planning for the rest of the century, studied and referenced by planners working on entirely different continents in entirely different wars decades after Howard's men had already gone home. The specific tool, the glider itself, largely disappeared from military use within a decade, rendered obsolete by helicopters that could achieve similar surprise with far greater flexibility and control. But the underlying principle that 6 flimsy plywood aircraft demonstrated in the dark outside Bénouville, that overwhelming force is not always the answer that precision rehearsal and audacity can achieve. What raw numbers cannot, that principle never went obsolete at all. It simply changed vehicles. And this is where the deeper lesson of this entire story starts to come into focus, because it is not really a story about gliders or bridges, or even about World War II specifically. It is a story about where genuinely transformative ideas actually come from, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment before we move to the final reveal. Notice what almost happened to this operation before it ever got off the ground. Some senior planners considered a glider assault on a heavily defended bridge at night, with zero margin for pilot error, to be reckless, bordering on suicidal. It required an unglamorous former police officer with no natural pedigree for battlefield command to spend 18 months turning that theoretically insane concept into a rehearsed, disciplined certainty through nothing but relentless, unglamorous repetition. This is a pattern that shows up again and again across military history whenever something genuinely decisive actually happens. The idea that ends up changing the course of a war rarely arrives from the most senior, most decorated, most obviously qualified source. It arrives from someone close enough to the actual problem to see a solution that looks crazy to anyone viewing it from a comfortable distance. And it only becomes history, rather than a footnote in a rejected proposal file, because someone was stubborn enough and disciplined enough to prove it could work before anyone with the authority to say no ever got the chance. You see the same pattern elsewhere throughout the war if you know where to look. The idea of building floating artificial harbors to support an invasion without capturing a port. First, the mulberry harbors that supplied the entire Normandy beachhead sounded absurd to many engineers when it was first proposed an idea for towing entire prefabricated ports across the English Channel piece by piece. It worked, and it solved a logistics problem that had genuinely threatened to strangle the entire invasion in its first weeks. The idea of deceiving an entire German army into believing the main invasion would land somewhere else entirely, built on fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and a phantom army group that existed only on paper, sounded like something out of a novel rather than a serious military plan. And it worked so completely that German reserves sat waiting in the wrong place for weeks after the real invasion had already begun. Over and over again, the pattern repeats. The unconventional idea, dismissed at first as impractical or even reckless, turns out to be exactly what wins the day, precisely because the enemy has planned meticulously for every conventional threat, and none of the unconventional ones. That pattern has not disappeared just because the war ended 8 decades ago. Modern military doctrine, modern business strategy, modern approaches to almost any high-stakes competitive problem. All of them still wrestle with the exact same institutional instinct that nearly kept Howard's mission grounded before it ever launched the instinct to reward proven familiar approaches and to treat genuinely novel ideas as threats to be managed rather than opportunities to be seized. The organizations and the individuals who manage to overcome that instinct, who create space for the officer, the engineer, the ordinary person with an idea that sounds slightly insane to actually test it under controlled conditions, rather than dismissing it outright, are disproportionately the ones who end up changing the outcome of whatever fight they happen to be in. And now the detail that most people who know the broad outline of this story have never actually heard the twist buried quietly in the background of the entire operation from the very beginning. Remember that cafe beside the bridge, the one still standing today, still run by the same family generations later. Before the war, it was owned by a French couple named Georges and Thérèse Gondry. What almost nobody knew at the time, and what remained largely unpublicized for years afterward, was that Thérèse Gondry had grown up partly in England and spoke fluent English, a fact she carefully concealed from the German soldiers who frequented her cafe throughout the occupation. Both she and her husband were quietly part of the local resistance network, feeding intelligence back to Britain. And in the months before the invasion, information gathered from conversations overheard in that very cafe. Conversations German soldiers had no idea were being understood by the woman serving them drinks made its way through resistance channels back to British intelligence, contributing to the detailed picture planners were building of the German garrison, its strength, and its habits around the bridges at Bénouville. The cafe that became famous after the war as the first house liberated in France was not simply a fortunate location that happened to sit beside a strategically vital crossing. It had, in its own small, quiet, dangerous way, already been part of the operation, long before a single glider ever left the ground in England. There is a second thread to this same twist, one that reaches even further into the strange, complicated aftermath of the war. The German commander whose forces fought against the British paratroopers holding the eastern perimeter in the days after the bridge fell was a panzer officer named Hans von Luck, a professional soldier who led the counterattacks against the very positions Howard's men and the wider 6th Airborne Division were struggling to hold through those brutal 10 days in June. Von Luck survived. The war was later held as a prisoner by the Soviets for years and eventually returned to civilian life in Germany. Decades later, in one of those details that feels almost too neat to be true and yet is entirely real, Von Luck began attending the same anniversary reunions at Pegasus Bridge that John Howard organized, standing on the same ground, where his forces and Howard's had once tried to kill each other and the two men, former enemies who had spent 10 days in June of 1944 doing everything in their power to destroy each other's forces, became genuine friends. In their later years returning together to walk the ground, where the fate of the entire eastern flank of Normandy had once hung on a matter of minutes and meters. That is the ending this story actually deserves. Not a simple tale of triumphant victors and defeated enemies, but a far more honest picture of what war actually leaves behind, once the guns finally fall silent. Old men who once tried to kill each other standing together decades later at the same quiet French bridge, united by nothing except having survived something neither of them ever fully stopped thinking about. So what do you actually take away from all of this after 4 parts and nearly 90 minutes spent inside the story of 2 small bridges most people have never heard of, held by fewer men than fit in a single modern office building, against an enemy that outnumbered them many times over? It comes down to this. A former Oxford policeman with no natural claim to military greatness spent 18 months turning an idea that senior officers considered close to suicidal into a certainty through nothing but relentless preparation. And in doing so, he and 180 men closed the single road the entire German army needed in order to crush the Normandy invasion in its first critical hours. They did it in under 10 minutes before the first wave of the actual invasion had even begun, and they held what they had taken for 10 brutal days afterward, against everything Germany could throw at that position, at a cost measured in the lives of men like Den Brotheridge, who never lived to meet the daughter born after his death, defending a bridge whose name would eventually be spoken by millions of people who never learned his own. The bridges at Bénouville did not win the war by themselves. No single action in a conflict that large ever does. But military historians who have studied the Normandy campaign in exhaustive detail keep arriving at the same conclusion from different directions, that without the eastern flank, held secure by Howard's company, and the paratroopers who reinforced them, the entire German counterattack that Rommel had spent months planning for might well have found its opening, and the cost of retaking a beachhead thrown back into the sea in lives, and in time, is almost impossible to calculate with any precision, except to say that it would have been counted in a currency far more expensive than the 181 men who held that ground in the dark. That is the real weight of this story, and it is the reason it deserves to be remembered with the same reverence usually reserved for the beaches themselves. Not because of the glory, because there was surprisingly little of that handed out at the time, but because of what it proves about what a small number of ordinary determined people can actually accomplish when they refuse to accept that something is impossible simply because nobody has ever done it before. An Oxford policeman, a glider pilot who flew an unpowered aircraft to a landing precise enough to be measured in single meters with 2 broken bones. Nobody yet knew about. A corporal who fired an unreliable weapon he had never used in real combat, and did not miss a French cafe owner who understood every word the German soldiers around her were saying, and never let it show. None of them set out to become the reason D-Day succeeded. They simply did the one job in front of them as well as it could possibly be done in the dark, with no second chances, and history quietly rearranged itself around what they accomplished in those first 10 minutes after midnight. The bridge still stands in Normandy today, a little south of the original. The actual span from that night preserved beside the museum built to tell this story properly, and every June fewer and fewer people who were actually there returned to walk across it. But the lesson it represents has never stopped being relevant, and it never will. It is not really a lesson about bridges or gliders or even about war itself. It is a lesson about what happens when someone is willing to prepare obsessively for a moment everyone else considers impossible, and then simply run toward it when that moment finally comes.